Something older than the pines watched from the dark, and the watching made the air feel like a held breath. The aurora braided itself across the sky in slow, green seams, a living stitch that made the world look like a thing sewn together and waiting to be opened. Snow lay in a hush so complete, it felt like a secret kept between stones. Even the river seemed to listen, its black ribbons swallowing moonlight and returning only a thin, patient steam. The night had the attention of something that kept accounts, old, patient, and not entirely human. He moved through that attention with the economy of a man who had learned to be careful. Boots sank and rose in a rhythm that had nothing to do with hurry. Each step was a small calculation against the cold. The spear at his shoulder was a familiar weight, the haft worn smooth where his palm had gripped it through winters and fights. Fur rhymed his collar like frost-bloomed lace. The cloak drank the aurora and left only shadow. He did not hurry. Haste is a kind of noise the land remembers. Scars mapped his hands and forearms, pale, raised lines that told stories he did not tell. One long white seam cut the knuckle of his left hand, a memory of steel and a night when the world had been less kind. The leather over his left shoulder bore a dent, where a spear had found him and not finished the work. Those marks were weather. They were facts, not complaints. He carried them like a man carries winter. The river was a black seam in the white, a ribbon that cut the plain and swallowed the moon. Its breath rose in thin threads that braided with his own. He paused at the bank and listened, not for sound so much as for the absence of it. The river had a voice older than the village, older than the cairns on the ridge. It spoke in currents and in the small, patient arithmetic of ice. Tonight it sounded like a ledger being turned, steady, inevitable. He checked the snares he had set along the path, hands moving with the quiet competence of someone who keeps hunger honest. A rabbit's trap had been sprung. A fox had taken a wrong turn and left a smear of dark in the snow. He closed the loop, reset the knot, and moved on. Each small task was a ritual that kept the world from unraveling. Food, fire, shelter. Rituals were thin comforts against the long, empty nights. Loneliness had a shape here. It sat in the hollow of his chest like a stone and made his breath come in even, careful measures. He had been a soldier once. The war taught a man how to hold a line and how to bury the dead without letting the cold in. Faces of those he had lost came sometimes in the hush between breaths, ghosts that did not demand anything but the memory of a name. He kept those names like tinder, useful, dangerous if left to smoulder. He did not speak them aloud. The land had its own memory and did not need him to remind it. There was a quiet focus to him that was almost religious. He moved as if the world were a map of small dangers and necessary mercies. When he paused to listen, the pines answered with a susurration that might have been wind, or might have been the echo of something older. He tilted his head, reading the night the way a man reads a ledger. Lines, margins, the small notations that tell you where the debt lies. The aurora above seemed to watch him back, a slow, indifferent witness. He thought of the cabin on the far side of the ridge, the low smoke that would mean a hearth and a woman who kept it. The thought was a small, private warmth, a thing he did not allow himself to name. It was enough to make his hands unclench for a moment, to make the ache behind his ribs ease like a tide. He had learned to keep his wants small. The world took more than it gave, and he had seen men ruined by asking for too much. one step, another. The night was a ledger of small sounds, the snap of a twig, the soft scrape of a fox, the distant creak of ice. He moved toward the river with the slow certainty of someone who knows how to read danger in the way snow lies. Moonlight made the plain a sheet of glass. The trees cast long, black fingers. The river's edge was a lip of black glass that drank the moon. He crouched and ran a gloved hand along the rimed bank, feeling the cold bite through leather. The scent there was faint, metal and old peat, like iron left in rain. Something was wrong in the snow near the river. The pattern of the plain had shifted, a circle of disturbed powder, a ring of scoured snow, as if something had been set down and then forgotten. Prince led to the edge and stopped, as if the ground had swallowed them. The line of tracks was too neat, too deliberate, as if whatever had made them had not been a stumbling animal, but a careful hand. He leaned closer, breath fogging the air, and saw a faint glow beneath the ice, pale and impossible, like a coin of moonlight trapped under glass. Warmth, too, a small, impossible warmth that made the snow around the ring melt in a thin halo. The cold should have held everything rigid, but here the world had a soft edge, as if something beneath the river had exhaled. He straightened, spear a line of intent. The watching between the trees tightened, as if whatever had been waiting had leaned forward. The ledger had a new entry, and the margin beside it was marked with a thing he did not yet understand. Something was wrong near the river. Ice cracked like a held promise breaking, a sharp, wrong sound that made the pines start and the aurora shiver. He moved before thought could shape itself. Spear up, breath a white blade in the air, because the world had taught him to answer danger with motion. The river's edge had been a lip of black glass. Now a ragged fissure ran through it, a mouth opened by something heavy and sudden. Snow slid in a soft avalanche, and the dark beneath the ice showed a shape. He knelt at the rim, and the cold bit through leather. The hole was a ragged eye in the river, and in its black pupil lay a woman. She was half submerged, hair fanned like dark reeds, face pale as driftwood, and the water around her held a faint, impossible warmth that fogged the air in a thin halo. Her skin was not the brittle, glassy thing of drowned bodies. It had the soft give of someone who might wake. That wrongness, warmth where there should be only death, made his mouth go dry. She wore linen that clung to her like a second skin, soaked and dark, and across the hollow of her throat, a band of something darker showed through the wet cloth. A mark, not carved but grown, a rune that seemed to drink the moonlight. It was small and precise, a knot of lines that did not belong to any farmer's stitch or hunter's brand. The sight of it made the air feel thinner, as if the night had leaned in to listen. He reached for the rim with gloved hands, fingers testing the brittle edge. The ice had been broken from within, not by a fall, but by a force that had pushed outward. Around the hole, the snow was scoured in a neat circle, as if someone had been set down and then forgotten. Prince led to the bank and stopped. The pattern was deliberate, like a hand placed on a ledger and left there. His spear lay across his knees, a line of intent. He did not know what he would do. Drag her out, leave her, call for help. But the choice was not his to make in the hush. The land had its own memory and its own rules. He had learned to move within them. He slid a hand into the water to test the warmth, and the cold took his breath. The river answered with a small, patient resistance, as if it did not want to give up what it held. When his fingers brushed the linen at her throat, the rune answered. It was not a blaze, but a whisper, a thread of light under wet cloth. A bell struck in a distant hall. The sensation ran up his arm like a cold current, and the hair along his forearm rose. The mark pulsed once, faint and precise, and the air around the hole tasted of iron and old prayers. He had seen signs in the field, omens carved into shields, priestesses' marks on altars. But this was different. This rune was intimate, as if it had been sewn into the world itself. She was wrong in other ways. Her breath, if she breathed, was a shallow thing that did not fog the air. Her eyelids fluttered like a moth's wing, but did not open. Her hands were pale and small, fingers curled as if holding something, invisible. There was a bruise at her temple, a smear of peat and blood, and the scent of peat rose from her like a memory. The river had kept her like a secret, and secrets have a way of being dangerous. Recognition slid through him like a blade of light. Not love, no, not yet, but a pull of curiosity and a caution that felt almost like respect. Her face had a shape that tugged at something in him, an echo of a woman he had once seen at a market, or perhaps a memory he had not yet earned. The world is full of echoes. Sometimes they are warnings. He did not know whether this was a blessing or a trap. He worked with the slow competence of a man who has learned to move when the world demands it. He found a length of driftwood and levered at the ice, prying the ragged edge wider. The river protested with a low, animal sound, and the hole gave with a groan. Water licked his gloves, the cold burned like a brand. He slid his arm under her shoulders and felt the weight of her like a sleeping thing. Her skin was warm enough to make his breath hitch, and the linen clung to him with the wet smell of river and peat. When he hauled her up and over the rim, the world narrowed to the press of her against him. The small, human heat, the damp of hair against his cheek, the rune at her throat a dark knot under linen. He laid her on the snow with the care of a man who has handled the dead and the living both. The difference between them is a thin, trembling line. Her chest rose once, a shallow, uncertain lift, and the rune pulsed again, this time with a faint blue thread that ran like a vein under the cloth. He bent close, breath fogging the air, and the rune's light answered his nearness with a whisper of sound, like a bell struck under water. The noise made the pines hush. He reached out, fingers trembling despite himself, and touched the wet linen over the mark. Something answered his touch, breath warm against his cheek. The damp of her hair a dark, river-scented smear on his shoulder. Too close, too human, and the world narrowed to the small, dangerous mercy of that heat. He carried her like a thing rescued from a grave, each step a careful prayer against the cold. The cabin's low roof waited like a mouth. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, patient thread. Inside, the hearth was a small, stubborn sun. He crossed the threshold, and the smell of peat and smoke wrapped around them like a cloak. He laid her on a pallet of furs with the tenderness of a man who had handled both the living and the dead, and learned the difference by touch. The linen clung to her like riverweed. When he peeled it back, the skin beneath was pale but not brittle, soft as if sleep had folded her into itself. Her hair fell across the pillow in a dark fan, and the damp made the air close with the scent of peat and cold water. He moved with the slow, exact motions of someone who knows how to keep a small life from slipping. A bowl of hot broth a strip of dry cloth, the careful coaxing of a fire that had been banked to embers. The rune showed itself when he loosened the wet linen at her throat. It was not a brand or a scar, but a knot of lines that seemed to have been grown rather than carved, an interlace of strokes that caught the firelight and drank it like a thirsty thing. The mark lay low and precise, a sigil that did not belong to any farmer's stitch or hunter's brand. It pulsed faintly, a thread of blue under the skin, as if a small moon had been set beneath her flesh. The sight of it made the hair along his forearms rise. The cabin's shadows seemed to lean in. Outside, the world answered in small, uncanny ways. The dog in the next yard lifted its head and whined once, a thin sound that cut the hearth's warmth. The raven on the fence post cawed and then fell silent, as if listening. Snow against the eaves stopped its soft tapping. Even the aurora seemed to braid tighter, a green seam that threaded the sky and made the cabin's single window glow like an eye. The air in the room tasted faintly of iron and old prayers, and the embers in the hearth flared as if someone had breathed on them. He wrapped her in furs, hands steady though his chest felt like a drum. The rune's pulse matched the beat of his own heart for a moment, and the coincidence made the world tilt. He had been a soldier. He had learned to read danger in the set of a jaw and the tilt of a spear. This was not the same language. This was a ledger written in water and names, and the mark at her throat read like a line in a book he had not been taught to open. He checked for wounds with the competence of habit, the bruise at her temple, the smear of peat along her cheek, the faint cut at her lip. Nothing that should have kept her from breathing. He cupped her wrist and felt the thin, stubborn pulse there, a thread of life that had not yet been claimed. He warmed broth between his palms and held it to her lips. The liquid steamed, and the scent of it made the room feel less like a tomb. He wanted to call for the woman who kept the cabin, to bring a priestess or a healer, but the thought of leaving her alone with whatever watched in the dark stopped him. He had learned to be a wall. She was wrong in ways that made his skin prickle. The warmth that had been under the water was not the warmth of a body that had simply been preserved. It was a living heat that hummed at the edges, like a thing that had been borrowed from the sun. Her fingers were curled as if holding something invisible. When he eased one open, the nails were clean, and the skin unmarked. The rune under the linen seemed to drink the hearthlight, and then give it back in a thin, blue thread that ran like a vein beneath the skin. He sat by the pallet and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. The cabin's small noises, wood settling, the dog's distant whine, the soft hiss of the hearth, felt amplified as if the room had been tuned to listen. He thought of the river's black seam and the way the ice had broken from within. He thought of the prints that had stopped at the water's edge. He thought of the ledger the land kept and how it sometimes took what it wanted in ways men could not understand. A memory slid through him. A child's laugh at a market, a woman's hand passing a coin, a priestess murmuring over a sickbed. The memory was a shard that did not fit the present, but made the edges of the moment sharper. He found himself whispering to her, not words of prayer, but small, human things. Her name, if he had known it, a promise that he would not leave, a vow that he would keep watch. The sound of his voice in the hush felt like a trespass and a benediction at once. The rune pulsed again, faint and precise, and the light under her skin brightened as if answering him. The air in the cabin cooled for a breath, and the embers dimmed. He leaned closer, breath fogging the space between them, and the rune's glow seemed to reach for his fingers. He placed a hand on her wrist and felt the pulse there, a stubborn, human rhythm that steadied him. Then, as if the world had been waiting for permission, she moved, a single, small motion. A finger flexed against his palm, the curl of a hand loosening like a knot undone. The movement was so slight it might have been a trick of the light, but it was movement nonetheless, a sign that the ledger had not yet closed its book. She woke with a word that did not belong to the room, and the word changed the meaning of everything. It slipped out of her like a breath held too long, a single syllable, thin and precise, as if plucked from a ledger and set down on the air. The sound made the hearth's embers shiver. The dog in the next yard whined and then fell silent. For a moment, the cabin felt too small for the thing that had been spoken. He was at her side before he knew he had moved, hands steady, the old soldier's reflex that answers a call without asking what it costs. Her eyes opened, and the pupils were wide and dark, reflecting the fire like two small moons. They did not look at him at first. They looked past him, as if seeing a place the room could not hold. Her breath came in shallow pulls, each one a fragile thing, and the rune at her throat glowed faintly under the skin, like a coin set in shadow. The word she had spoken was not a name he knew. It was older than the market's gossip, older than the cairns on the ridge. It had the weight of a thing that keeps accounts. He leaned closer, the heat of his breath fogging the space between them, and the rune answered with a small, cold flare that made the hair along his forearms rise. The light under her skin pulsed once, twice, as if counting. She tried to speak again, and the sound that came was a memory, not a sentence. The hiss of water over stone, the small, hot weight of a child's chest under cupped hands, a voice that was not human offering terms in a hush. Her lips moved around images, peat, iron, a seam sewn into flesh, and the fragments tumbled out like coins spilled from a pouch. The memory was jagged and bright, a thing that did not belong to the cabin's warm hush. He listened without asking, because some things are not for questions. The soldier in him catalogued the facts. The bruise at her temple, the smear of peat on her cheek, the stubborn pulse at her wrist. The man who had buried friends and enemies both felt the old, familiar ache of helplessness when faced with a mystery that could not be solved by spear or oath. He wrapped a fur tighter around her shoulders and let his hands be the small, practical things that kept her life from slipping. Her voice came again, softer, as if the sound itself were afraid of waking something else. "Water remembers," she said, and the words were not quite hers. There was an echo in them, a cadence that belonged to river halls and long nights. The rune at her throat pulsed in answer, and the cabin's single window seemed to darken, as if the night outside had leaned in to listen. He felt the room tilt, the way a man feels a ship change course underfoot. She blinked, and a new image came, a hall of stone, candles guttering, hands passing a token across a table. She mouthed the shape of the token without naming it, and the sight of her lips forming the motion made something in him clench. The fragments of her memory were not linear. They were shards that fit, together only in the river's logic. He could see the bargain in the way her shoulders folded, in the way her fingers curled as if still holding something invisible. He wanted to ask her name, to anchor her to the world with a sound that belonged to men and markets. He wanted to know whether she had kin, whether a hearth waited for her in some distant valley. But the question felt too small for the ledger that hummed under her skin. Instead, he pressed his palm to her wrist and let the warmth of his hand be a promise. "I will not leave you here." She turned her head toward him then, and for a breath the room narrowed to the two of them. Her gaze found his with a clarity that made the soldier in him drop his guard. There was fear there, yes, but also a fierce, private thing. Regret, perhaps, or the memory of a vow. Her lips moved, and the sound was a name he did not know. But the way she said it made him feel as if he had been given a map and not yet learned to read it. "Not yet," she whispered, and the words were a small, terrible prayer. "Not yet. He counts." The rune flared at the last syllable, a bright, cold bell under the skin, and the cabin's shadows seemed to lean away, as if something outside had heard and answered. He tightened the fur around her and rose, the motion a shield. The hearth's light threw their silhouettes long across the floorboards. The aurora braided the sky beyond the window like a seam. He wanted to call for the woman who kept the cabin, to fetch a healer or a priestess, but the thought of leaving her alone with whatever watched in the dark stopped him. He had learned to be a wall. He would be the wall now. She closed her eyes as if to gather the fragments into a whole, and when she spoke again, the sound was not a plea, but a warning. "They come for the mark." The words fell into the hush like a stone, and the night outside answered with a wind that carried the scent of peat and iron. The ledger had been opened, the margin had been marked. The danger that had been only a shadow at the river's edge now had a name. Silence sat between them like a held thing, heavy and intimate, the kind of hush that makes the smallest breath feel like a confession. He kept his hand on her wrist, feeling the stubborn pulse beneath the skin, and the warmth of her hand was a small, dangerous mercy in the cold room. The hearth's light threw their shadows long and close. The air smelled of peat and wet wool, and something older, like riverstone warmed by sun. For a moment, the world narrowed to the press of two bodies, and the rune's faint, steady glow beneath linen. She lay with her head turned toward him, lashes trembling, as if the memory of sleep still clung to them. When she spoke, it was a sound that belonged to the river, soft, patient, threaded with a cadence that did not fit the cabin's hearth. "I was a woman who mended," she said, and the words were small as a stitch. "I took what I could to keep alive." The confession was not a story so much as a ledger entry, precise, terrible, and offered without flourish. The rune answered as if it had been waiting for the sentence. The light under her skin brightened, a thin blue that ran like a vein, and the air in the room cooled as if a window had been opened onto the river. He felt the change in his bones, a tightening, a readiness. The mark pulsed again, stronger this time, and the sound it made was like a bell struck underwater. The dog outside whined. The raven on the fence post cawed once and fell silent. Even the aurora seemed to braid itself tighter, a green seam that threaded the sky and made the cabin's single window glow like an eye. He had expected fear, or anger, or some frantic plea. Instead, she spoke with a quiet that made the soldier in him lower his guard. "I gave a name," she said, and the syllables were a thing folded in on themselves. "I thought it would be enough." Her fingers flexed against the fur, the motion small and human, The way she said it, without drama, without apology, made something in him tilt toward her. Not pity, not yet. Something like recognition. A fellow traveler who had learned to bargain with the world and had come away with a wound. He wanted to ask what name, what life, what price. He wanted to know whether the ledger could be read and balanced. But the question felt too blunt for the hush. Instead, he smoothed the damp hair from her forehead with a thumb that trembled despite himself. The contact was a vow without words. He had been a man of orders and lines. Now he found himself learning the grammar of small mercies. The rune flared again, and this time the reaction was not only light, but a ripple that ran through the cabin. The embers in the hearth flared and then dimmed. The dog's whine became a long, low note. She inhaled sharply, and the sound was a small, frightened thing. Memory flashed across her face. Images that did not belong to the room. A child's fevered face, hands cupping a small chest, a hall of stone where candles guttered, and men counted names. The fragments tumbled out in a hush, not as a narrative, but as impressions. Peat, iron, a seam sewn into flesh. He listened, and the soldier in him catalogued the facts. Wounds, marks, the stubborn pulse, while another part of him catalogued the shape of her mouth when she said the word name, the way her fingers curled as if still holding something invisible. Fascination crept in like thaw, slow, inevitable. He had seen many things in the field. Omens carved into shields, priestesses' marks on altars. But this rune was intimate, as if the river had written its ledger into her skin. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. She turned her head and looked at him with an intensity that made the room feel too small. "I do not know what I have become," she whispered, and the admission was a blade wrapped in silk. "Sometimes I think the water kept me whole. Sometimes I think it kept me for itself." The fear in her voice was not for herself alone. It was a fear that named a thing coming for what the river had claimed. The rune pulsed in sympathy. A bell struck in a distant hall. He wanted to promise her safety with a soldier's certainty. He wanted to say he would stand between her and whatever ledger the world kept. Instead, he let his hand rest on her shoulder, the pressure a small, human anchor. The closeness between them deepened not in a single grand gesture, but in a string of mercies. The way he warmed the broth and held it to her lips, the way he smoothed the furs around her, the way his breath matched hers until their chests rose and fell in the same slow rhythm. Each small act braided them tighter. There was a moment, thin and electric, when their faces were inches apart, the rune's glow painting his cheek in blue. He could have asked her name then, could have offered his own, could have made a vow that would have been both foolish and true. The words hovered and did not fall. The world outside the cabin pressed against the window, like a thing listening. A sound cut through the hush, a distant crunch of boots on packed snow, the soft, unmistakable clink of metal. He froze, every muscle a taut wire. The sound came again, closer, a measured step, then another, the rhythm of men who move with purpose. Torches bobbed like distant stars along the ridge, and a low horn answered from the dark, a note that rolled across the plain and into the valley. She turned her head toward the window, eyes wide with a fear that made the soldier in him harden. The rune at her throat flared bright as a struck coin, and the cabin's single window framed the approaching light like a judge's bench. "They come," she said, and the word was not a question. They came like a shadow uncoiling, hooves that ate the hush, torches bobbing like angry stars, a low horn that rolled across the plain and set the pines to whispering. The sound hit the cabin like a verdict. He heard it before he saw it. The rhythm of riders, the scrape of leather, the metallic ring of harnesses. The night narrowed to that sound, and the small, hot room, where a woman with a rune at her throat lay breathing under furs. He moved with the speed of a man who has learned to answer a ledger with action. The hearth's light threw his shadow long across the floorboards as he rose. Every motion a calculation, how to hide, how to hold, how to make the world believe the cabin was empty. He did not wake the woman. He let his hand rest on her wrist and felt the stubborn pulse, the small human rhythm that steadied him. The closeness between them was a thing that had no name yet, only the weight of a vow forming in the space between his ribs. Outside, the riders slowed. The torches painted the window in a wash of orange. The aurora braided the sky above like a green seam, indifferent and vast. He could hear the leader's voice, low and precise, the kind of voice that gives orders and expects them kept. The sound of men searching is a different animal from the sound of men at war. This was methodical, patient, the sort of hunt that reads the land for secrets. They would not be fooled by smoke or a single hearth. They would read the ledger of tracks and margins and find what they wanted. He had choices that were all small and dangerous. He could hide her in the loft beneath the eaves, tuck her among the sacks, and hope the rider's eyes skimmed past. He could carry her out the back and into the trees, trusting the pines to swallow two shadows. He could stand at the door and meet them with spear and oath. Each option had a cost. Each choice was a line drawn in snow. He chose the line that put his body between the danger and the thing he had not yet named. He moved to the door with the quiet of a man who has learned to be a wall. The latch was old and stiff. His fingers worked it with a soldier's patience. He did not bar the door with planks. There was no time for that. But he set his shoulder against it and let the wood be the hinge of his intent. The spear leaned within reach, a familiar weight that steadied his hands. She watched him with eyes that had learned to read danger in the tilt of a jaw. The rune at her throat pulsed faintly, a blue thread beneath linen, and the light it gave was a small, private thing. He could have asked her to move, to hide, to speak a name that might buy them time. Instead, he pressed his palm to her wrist and let the contact be a promise. I will not let them take you. The touch was a vow that did not need words. Their connection deepened in the hush that followed, not in a single grand gesture, but in a string of mercies. The way he smoothed the furs over her shoulders, the way his breath fogged the space between them, the way his eyes lingered on the rune, as if trying to read the ledger written beneath skin. He thought of the war and the men he had buried, of the small, stubborn things that keep a life from unraveling. He thought of the market woman he had once watched from a distance, of the way a hand can be both a tool and a benediction. He had not meant to care. The world had a way of making care a necessity. The riders' voices came closer, a chorus of low commands and the scrape of boots on packed snow. A shadow passed the window, and the torchlight painted the room in quick, dangerous strokes. He could hear the leader's boot on the porch, the soft creak of wood under weight. The sound made the cabin feel like a throat about to be opened. He crouched by the pallet and met her eyes. There was fear there, yes, but also a fierce, private steadiness. Someone who had bargained with the river and come back with a seam sewn into her flesh. She did not speak. She did not need to. The look they shared said what words could not yet hold. Stay quiet. I will stand. He moved to the door and set his shoulder against it. The wood was cold and the grain bit into his palm. He heard the leader's voice outside, a low thing that read like a ledger. Search the cabin, it said, and the order was a blade. The men moved like a tide, boots on the porch, torches held high. The latch rattled as a hand tested it. He thought of the rune's glow, of the way the river had kept her warm under ice, of the bargain that had been struck in a night of fever and peat. He thought of the ledger the land kept, and how men like these read its margins for profit and power. He thought of the child's laugh he had seen in the river's film, and the small life that had been saved by a name taken. He thought of the cost. The latch gave a soft, testing sound. A shadow filled the doorway, a silhouette framed by torchlight. The leader's cloak was furred, and his helm caught the fire in a hard, indifferent gleam. He paused on the threshold as if listening to the room's silence. And then his voice came, low, precise, and carrying a weight that made the air in the cabin tighten. Nerith, he said, and the name fell into the hush like a stone. The word was not a question. It was a confirmation. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This tale is inspired by Nordic dreams and heart. Stay close for the next chapter of this saga. With love, Claire.